All right, episode 15 of the Coded for Chaos podcast. This episode we have George Beebe. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
No relationship to Don Beebe, the wide receiver, but infamous for his time at the Quincy Institute, which we're going to learn a little bit more about. What does the Quincy Institute do?
Well, we're a think tank, like many others in Washington, but we have a little bit different perspective than what I would say the mainstream think tanks do. Most think tanks are aligned with one party or another. You're either sort of on the Democratic side or the Republican side. And most of them generate research, they produce papers, they produce opinions, policy recommendations. But they tend to be aligned with the direction that a political party is going. Quincy is nonpartisan. We're not aligned with either the Republican or Democratic parties. In fact, we make a conscious effort to bring left and right together around a new approach to American foreign policy that is a departure from what we've done through the bulk of the post-Cold War period. And the bulk of that period has been a period of unipolarity, a period when the United States had no peer rivals or even close to peer rivals in the world. Our power militarily, economically, politically was so unmatched by anyone that we could basically get our way, and we didn't have to engage in a lot of diplomatic compromising and balancing and taking into account other states' interests on things. We could simply say, this is the way it's going to be. The problem with that is we got into some bad habits. We decided to attempt to re-engineer some other countries' societies, engage in social engineering, regime change. And we took on, I think, projects that were way beyond our capability, and that produced what came to be known as endless wars. And we also overextended ourselves. There was a huge gap between our objectives and our capabilities that emerged. And I think there's no clearer sign of that than what is now a $38 trillion national debt, which is a big problem. But what Quincy is saying essentially is that unipolar era is over. We now face a different world, a world that's increasingly polycentric, where we have China and other powers that may not yet quite be the peers of the United States across the board, but they're definitely capable of asserting their interests and posing threats to the United States that we have to take a lot more seriously. That means we have to reinvigorate diplomacy. We have to have a much smarter grand strategy. We need to make sure that our objectives in the world are very much guided by our national interests. And that's something that we believe both left and right of the political spectrum in the United States ought to embrace. And if we don't reorient ourselves, we're going to get ourselves in a whole lot of trouble. That could be stumbling into great power conflict, which wouldn't go well for anyone involved. So that's really where we're coming from.
Do you think we're reinvigorating diplomacy right now? Are we trending in the direction that the Quincy Institute thinks we need to trend into? Or
well, I think so, yes. I think if you look at the new grand strategy, the national security strategy that the Trump administration has published, that is a strategy of retrenchment. It is saying we're going to back away from objectives in the world that have really been counterproductive and not geared to the core interests of the American people. We're going to prioritize, recognizing that we don't have unlimited resources and unlimited capabilities. And when you don't have unlimited capabilities, you have to say, okay, what matters most to the United States? What matters most to our security? What matters most to the prosperity of the American people? What matters most to the ability to function as a republic, as we were conceived? And that means a strategy that says, here's what's most important, here's next. And certain things we're going to say, hey, look, they're not core interests of the United States. Other countries are going to have to deal with those sorts of things.
So does that mean kind of dividing up the world like basically ceding part of the world to the other great powers, like China kind of dominates one hemisphere, and Russia dominates another, and the U.S. dominates the third, or is it?
I don't think that's the conception behind this strategy. I think what the Trump administration is saying is all of these great powers have certain core security concerns that have to be respected. If you're going to cross the red lines of another great power, you're headed toward a conflict. That's not a good thing. But I don't think we're envisioning ceding entire swaths of the globe to other great powers. And I think what the Trump folks are doing with Ukraine is a good example of that. One way of trying to settle this conflict could have been to say to the Russians, Ukraine, that's your sphere of influence. What happens there is your concern, not ours. That's not what they've done.
Right.
What they've said to the Russians is, we understand you have core security concerns, as do we. When the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles on Cuba, we said, hey, no, that crosses a red line for American security.
Right.
Doesn't matter to us whether Cuba invited the Soviet Union to put those missiles on its territory. Doesn't matter that Cuba approached the Soviet Union and said, we want a military alliance. We want your protection from the United States. The Kennedy administration said, yeah, Cuba's freedom to choose its own military allies does not trump the core security concerns of the United States. So we drew a line there. But what we're doing with the Russians in Ukraine is saying, we understand you've got security concerns there. We will respect those concerns, but we're not going to cede Ukraine as an exclusive sphere of influence to Russia.
Yeah.
Ukraine is going to continue to have normal diplomatic discourse with the United States. We're going to be involved economically there, as we've already seen with some of the economic deals that we're working out with the Ukrainians and all of this. And we've insisted that the Russians concede that Ukraine will become part of the European Union one day. In other words, yes, we'll respect security concerns, but Ukraine can still be economically and politically a part of the West. And I think that's a pragmatic compromise. And that's the kind of thing that I think is representative of what the Trump administration is envisioning.
Yeah.
Here, we'll respect security concerns. We're not going to cede spheres of influence.
If you were to get inside the head of Russian leaders, do you think they really truly believe there were security concerns with Ukraine?
Yes.
That's like this isn't just a made up thing to take over.
I believe they really thought this was a threat that was emerging. And I think it's quite clear when you look at what the New York Times published, retrospectively, years after the Russian invasion. They did an expose of what the United States was doing in establishing deep security and intelligence cooperation between our government and Ukraine. We were training the Ukrainian military quite extensively. We were doing so in a way that made their military practices compatible with that of NATO. We were preparing for a period in which there could be integration between the Ukrainian military and that of NATO. We were establishing CIA intelligence bases throughout Ukraine, retrofitting ports and infrastructure so that they could accommodate U.S. ships, for example, and other systems. I think the Russians looked at all of that and said, hey, well, wait a minute. If these trends continue, it's easy for us to envision a period of time where the Ukrainian military and intelligence services are so deeply integrated with those of the United States and NATO that if we wanted to take military action to say, hey, enough, this is a threat to Russia, the only way Russia could do that would be to fight us as well as Ukraine. And they were not willing to get into that situation, because at that point, if the United States were to say, okay, we're going to actually bring Ukraine into the NATO alliance, the Russians really would have to go to war with NATO to prevent that. And that was not a future that they were willing to live with.
Yeah, you don't really ever hear that kind of unpacked that way with the infrastructure that was being put into place, and I could see, theoretically see how a decision maker on that side might feel that way. Um, what is a red line that would exist, you think, in the next 365 days, where would force the Russians to use tactical nuclear weapons or something? And
Well, first of all, I think that's something the Russians don't want to do, because that would almost certainly cause an escalatory spiral. The United States, wouldn't sit by and say, "Oh, you've used tactical nuclear weapons, and we're not going to do anything about that." We would have to react in some way, not necessarily with a nuclear response. In fact, my guess would be we would not begin with a nuclear response. But um, what I think would push the Russians to use tactical nuclear weapons is if they thought their backs were against the wall in some way.
yeah,
Right now, that doesn't look likely in Ukraine the way the war is going. The Russians have, I think, an increasing advantage over time. So current trends aren't pointing in the direction of the Russians feeling like they're going to be cornered and face some sort of defeat. What I would be concerned about would be a different scenario where, just to pick an example, Lithuania or some Western actor were to close access to Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is an exclave of Russia. During the Soviet period, it was a part of the Soviet Union.
right. And there's a highway that connects
It had direct land access to all this because these now independent states were Soviet republics, the Baltics, Belarus, etc. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, that direct land access is gone. So the Russians rely on air and sea access. And nobody has really interfered with that, although the Lithuanians flirted with that a few years ago. And I think the EU told the Lithuanians, "Hey, you're playing with fire here, back off." And
they weren't able to negotiate some sort of like the road that used to go from West Germany to Berlin, where you could sort of travel there if you were a Westerner, or like take the duty train to Berlin or something. There's nothing like that between Kaliningrad and
well, there are understandings about access that are in place, but there's no direct territorial link
Right.
that the Russians control.
a Russian trucker could drive across.
Only with permission.
Yeah, right.
That's the issue here. So if, for example, some, the Lithuanians, to pick an example, were to say, "Okay, we've had it with Moscow. We're really going to try to put the screws to them. We're going to deny this access." I think that's a very dangerous situation, because Kaliningrad, as far as I understand it, probably has more nuclear weapons per square kilometer than any other
No,
place
I didn't
in
realize
the
it.
world.
Really?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
the
Tactical nukes.
tactical nukes.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Now, would the Russians sit by quietly as access to this land and these nuclear weapons is denied? That's a very touchy situation. At that point, you could see a situation where the Russians might say, "Okay, look, we are not going to allow NATO to take over this territory and take over these nuclear weapons."
Do they have so many tactical nukes there because that's as furthest west deployed they can get them?
That's a legacy of the Soviet era. These were tactical nuclear weapons storage areas that were meant to deal with contingencies both at sea and on land.
Okay.
Dealing
When
with
there's a port there, they can kind of service them and do whatever. Yeah, and that's a warm water port too, right? So it makes a difference.
So that's a scenario where you could get into a very difficult escalation cycle that might result in a tactical nuclear use of some kind to really send the message, "Hey, look, this is serious. You need to back off."
How much are the North Koreans still behind the scenes and the Chinese behind the scenes in supporting the Russian effort in Ukraine?
Well, clearly the North Koreans have been providing troops and weapons support. Um, I think most people think of North Korea as a basket case, and in some respects that's an actual a very accurate picture. But in certain areas, the North Koreans actually bring a lot to the table. One is in artillery shell production. You know, to some degree, when you look around the world at the ability to pump out large volumes of artillery shells, North Korea is one of those places that does that pretty well. And the war in Ukraine has become, to a great degree, a battle of artillery. And the Russians have really stepped up their own production of this, but they've got a lot of support from the North Koreans on that too. And that matters because Ukraine and the West together can't produce the volume of artillery shells that the Russians and North Koreans are producing.
I always wondered when we would do war games and sort of involve the Chorwan Valley in Korea, and you saw how many firing positions the North Koreans had, hidden in mountains, like where all this resupply was coming from. We never really got to that part of it because we were really just focused on the firing positions and stuff. But there had to be a machine behind that was pumping out all these shells.
Yeah, that's
leading
right.
to the, and now that's useful in this particular conflict.
No, absolutely right. And this is an area overall where the Russians, I think, have performed quite impressively. There's parts of this war where the Russians had been rather unimpressive, but parts where they've really stood out. And one is the ability to bring volume. The United States, throughout the post-Cold War period, really focused on producing very expensive, very high-tech, exotic weapons in relatively small numbers that were useful in short confrontations, short wars. But when you're in a war with a great power where volume matters, the ability to sustain engagement for a long period of time, which is what this war in Ukraine is.
Especially humans, just sending humans into the meat grinder.
Well, to some degree, that's right. Although I think the degree to which the Russians have relied on meat grinder tactics is exaggerated.
Is there? That's right.
Yeah.
You hear that used a lot. I'm just mimicking what people say. Yeah,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't think that's really the way the Russians have fought this war. But it is definitely a war of attrition. And the Russians have demonstrated a capacity to produce volumes that far exceed the volumes that the United States and Europe and Ukraine have been able to produce combined.
Right.
And that's, I think, a big problem. I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing President Trump taking the approach that he's been taking to U.S. defense industry. He's been saying, hey, look, the era of very expensive, small numbers of weapons that you can't sustain over a long period of time has got to end.
Yep.
We have to be able to produce in volume.
We got to have 155 artillery shells, 105 artillery shells. We need to be able to pump those out.
Right. Yeah, and you have to produce Patriot missiles at a much greater pace.
Is that because the defense industry has not wanted to build more factories because that's expensive and they, cuts into their margins? What is the reason for that?
Well, I'm not an expert in this particular area, but I think part of this is if you're going to invest in greater capacity, greater volume, build more factories, you need sufficient labor, and I'm not sure that we've got that right now, the trained labor force to sustain that, and that's an issue.
Is building artillery shells that complicated?
No, but you do need a workforce
to
do that. But when you build a factory, you're taking a leap of faith. You're taking a leap of faith that your customer is going to want to buy this for a long time to come. And I'm not sure that defense industry has had the confidence that the U.S. government is going to be there 5 years from now. If I invest now and I build, 3, 4 more factories to do this, am I going to be left eating losses 5, 10 years from now because the U.S. government has said, this is great, but we don't want to sustain that
Is that why
way
the
that,
U.S. government is talking about investing more in the defense industry to
yes,
kind of provide that confidence?
that's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. And I think the Trump administration is taking steps to incentivize that kind of investment and to disincentivize other ways of making profits
Yeah.
for these firms.
Because I know plenty of like towns in the Midwest that we would love to have a 155 artillery shell factory,
That's right.
and plenty of guys that know enough about blowing things up that could probably go and work there and be pretty efficient at it.
That's right.
Uh,
And the kinds of things that Trump was talking about with executive pay, for example, putting caps on executive pay, absent investment in new production facilities,
yeah,
um, and putting restrictions on stock buybacks and that sort of thing. All of this is meant to get America's defense industry working and producing at a much greater scale than it has been.
yeah. Because that right now the general narrative is that that's kind of everything. It kind of gets into the everything so on one side that no one's taking a lot of these things seriously, even though they might be very serious propositions to do this, because there's so much. I hate to use like derangement syndrome, but there's so much. If he said it, it must be bad kind of stuff, and it's getting us away from being able to like seriously unpack some of these things and how they might actually be the right move, because nobody wants to back any of these things. As a matter of fact, a little bit ago, Secretary of State Rubio said President Trump is someone who is not limited by what others say is possible. I thought that was really good. I mean, that kind of summarizes the.
I think that's a pretty apt description.
Yeah,
That's
and
right.
so yeah, and so like I didn't get to see the rest of his speech because it was happening sort of in real time before we started recording this. Where's so with China? Where do we stand on? Do you think we're at a point where, as great power rivals, where do we stand on a sort of a rival to rival scale? They basically watched this very closely for decades. In the first Gulf War, they looked at our massive dominance over the Iraqi army. They saw how we were able to fight at night, and they said, "Okay, we got to figure this out." And then they spent decades um, trying to build this equivalent type of capability so that they could, fight an adversary like the United States. And then, we continued to pump tons of money into their economy through buying, rubber trinkets and things like that. And I think to a certain extent, we thought if we keep collaborating and working with them, that the society will open up. Maybe from a naive perspective, we did that. And now we're in this position where like, holy crap, they've got really cool weapons. They've got these capabilities that we didn't think anybody would have that look very similar to ours. Their cyber capabilities are amazing. We're kind of at a place now where the only thing keeping them from doing a lot of super terrible cyber things is, could affect our economy, and we're very intricately aligned with each other. But also we have that almost nuclear deterrent because we also have awesome cyber capabilities. This is me just sort of setting the stage. You're the expert. Where are we in that competition?
Well, when I began my career, there was a Soviet Union,
Right.
and the world was bipolar. And the challenge that we faced was a country that was a military giant, a military peer, really, with the United States, but economically not particularly impressive. And nobody was buying Soviet cars or Soviet computers
Right.
or Soviet.
You didn't have a lot of
Commercial.
in Washington.
Yeah. And so the economy was quite distorted, very heavily geared toward military industry, not integrated into the world economy, and intentionally so. The Soviet Union really chose the path of economic autarky. It did not want to integrate into the global economic system, really. And so that made containment possible. You could contain the Soviet Union militarily. It almost chose to contain itself economically by virtue of the system that it had adopted. And ideologically, we could fight against the spread of communist thought, communist thinking, that system. And we had a competition that eventually focused on the third world as what we called the third world then, as what we now call the global south, decolonized and started to choose um, economic and political systems in their new era of independence. And we were engaged in this tug of war over the allegiance of these countries. Um, we grew accustomed to that. We know how to deal with that kind of challenge. The approach that we took strategically, containment, essentially worked. And it bought time for the Soviet Union really to fall into disrepair and eventually collapse upon itself. China is a much different challenge. It's a challenge that the United States has never faced before in its history. The model that we used during the Cold War period won't work with China. China is increasingly a military peer of the United States, doesn't have the global reach or global power projection capabilities that we have. But when you look at its ability militarily in the parts of the world that China cares most about, it's a peer. It is increasingly building up its nuclear forces. Not a nuclear peer yet. 10 years from now, could it be on par with the United States? I think, yeah. I think that's the direction that the Chinese nuclear force is heading. But unlike the Soviet Union, China is an economic peer. And if you measure by purchasing power parity, China's GDP is greater than that of the United States right now. It's the world's leading industrial power. It manufactures far more than the United States does. It greatly outpaces the United States in shipbuilding capability. Its ability to build and manage ports, far beyond that of the United States. In certain areas of high technology, they're leading the United States. Not at all. I mean, there are many areas where we continue to be the leader. But this is not like the Soviet challenge. This is a rival that is deeply integrated, not just into the global economic system, but into the American economy itself.
Yeah.
And increasingly has control of things that the United States is absolutely dependent on. And we saw that during COVID. And suddenly we're like, wait a minute, we need medical supplies. Where do we get them? We can't get them without going to China. There are critical elements of our supply chain absolutely dependent on China for. And then if you look at what they've been doing in taking advantage of their dominance of strategic minerals, rare earths, that they have invested in, not just the mining, but the processing of this. These are things that are absolutely critical to the American economy, without which we're in big trouble. And then you add on top of that, not just cyber, but space. The American economy and the American military are absolutely dependent on space, on this constellation of satellites that are orbiting the Earth, that back in the Cold War days were essentially untouchable. You put the satellites up there and, they were safe and secure. Not the case anymore.
Right.
They are now vulnerable, not just to attack from land, but to attacks in space. And the Chinese have invested in this in a big way. Again, this is not something that the United States has had to deal with before. How do you deal with a peer rival that has increasing dominance in areas where the United States is very vulnerable? You can't contain it. Containment doesn't work with a problem like that.
Do you think that's why the defense strategy that came out recently sort of downplayed the language when it came to China to kind of lower the temperature, or was it because they viewed it as differently as from the past? Or
Well, I think the strategy as it deals with China and the NSS is actually quite sophisticated. It's a combination of deterrence, building up military capabilities that discourage Chinese aggression.
right.
Diplomacy, economic competition, making sure that we're not vulnerable to Chinese dominance or monopoly on things that are strategically significant to the United States, and engagement in diplomacy. Um, all of those things have got to be part of our strategy for dealing with China. And I think ultimately what President Trump is aiming for is not to defeat China. You're not going to defeat a power like this. Um, it certainly to avoid a military confrontation with China.
Right.
And I think the idea here is to create a military capability on our part that discourages China from testing us in that area. I think that's prudent. That's basic deterrence 101. But also recognizing that because there is this deep intertwining of our economies, that there has to be um, some sort of continued engagement there. We have to figure out what are the rules of the game between the United States and China. How can we respect the other side's core interests while defending our own, not allowing our own red lines to be crossed, creating a balance of power and a balance of interests, and some basic understandings about where the no-go zones are,
Yeah.
so that China understands what's critical to the United States. We understand what's critical to them, and we find some way of making sure that we don't wind up in a confrontation. Now, to do that, you can't simply approach the Chinese and say, "Hey, can't we all just get along?"
Yeah.
These are power relationships, ultimately. There has to be.
Because it's China, because that's all they respect, or is
That's the way the world works.
Yeah.
It always has.
it's not just China?
Yeah, it always has. The international system is based on power. And so if you're going to approach a negotiation with another great power and you want some assurance that your own red lines are going to come out of that intact, you've got to have sufficient power and leverage to engage in that negotiation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not going to go well.
What are examples where they've actually played by the rules in a scenario where we've negotiated something with them? Are there examples? Because all you ever hear about is them not playing by the rules, stealing all of our intellectual property, and signing up for things that they never really abide by.
Well, I to some degree, that's not unique to China. That's essentially the way great powers have operated throughout history. Um, when you combine diplomacy with power to back this up, you're most likely to have success. We dealt with the Soviet Union this way as well. There's an old Russian expression that Ronald Reagan adopted: trust but verify.
Right.
That means you enter into agreements that are in the mutual interest of the parties. They're in our interest, they're in the interest of the other side, so that there's an incentive, a self-interest that they have in adhering to them. And then you couple that with verification,
Yeah.
monitoring, um, making sure that the other side is complying. Now, what happens if they don't? That's where power comes in.
Yeah.
Right. You want to build a combination of power balance, interest balance, and the diplomatic engagement that incentivizes these countries to respect the agreements that you've reached. And they have to be in the mutual interests of the parties. When they're not, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
And we've seen that throughout history too. When you reach agreements with other countries that are reached, with a gun to their heads, and they feel they're unfair and not in their interests, those kinds of agreements don't tend to last very long. That's what happened after World War I. So where are we going with China? I think we're headed toward, a situation where we work out this balancing our respective self-interests, balancing the power, reaching some understandings that we both believe are in our interests, recognizing the consequences of failure could be catastrophic for everybody involved. You know, we get into a war with China, we're all going to come out of that, if we come out of it, badly, badly damaged.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen some open source war games where all the satellites are shot out of space in 2 seconds, and then we're fighting this sort of like Stone Age war against each other. And then,
Well, yeah. And this, of course, is a problem. And I mentioned earlier our dependence on space. A lot of people don't realize that we can't go through a day without relying on satellites.
yeah,
I came here today with GPS.
Right.
That's an easy one, right? That doesn't work, but if we don't have these satellites. But I also filled up a tank of gas. Most people don't understand. I couldn't have done that without satellites.
Yeah.
Why? I paid with a credit card at the pump.
Yeah.
In order to do that, there has to be a giant synchronization of financial flows, which are all electronic. Those systems are synchronized through space. And if that goes down, I can't go to the pump and put my credit card there. This is critical to the American economy.
It's everything.
That's right. And this gets to Greenland. Right?
Yeah.
People are saying, why is Trump insisting that we have to have Greenland? Well, that has a lot to do with space.
Yeah.
These satellites that are orbiting the Earth, if you're going to communicate with them and if you're going to protect them, one of the best geographic positions to have in doing that is Greenland.
Yeah.
Over that pole. If we have it, we're going to be a lot more secure in space than we are right now.
Do we have to have the deed to secure Greenland? Like I think was said yesterday, Trump's a real estate guy, so he's like, I want the deed and I want to own it, and like that's the only way. But if we were able to, I'm not sure. Like this is a question. Like if we were able to get NATO to cooperate and basically say, U.S. build what you need to defend the Western world, have at it, with the caveat of you got to do it within these environmental regulations and all this sort of stuff. That might be where it slows everything down, especially from a real estate guy's perspective. It's like,
yeah,
I need to build all this stuff, but now I'm gonna have to follow these crazy EU rules about melting ice and all this other things. Can we do this without owning Greenland, or like physically actually owning it? Or
my guess is yes and no.
Yeah.
Part of this is the confidence that you have in the stability of your allies.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the national security strategy and the way it described what was going on in Europe, which is a description I subscribe to, by the way, but basically what they were saying is Europe is committing suicide.
Yeah.
It is inflicting so much self-damage that Europe, as we have come to think of it, may not look at all the way it does today, 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things the strategy was saying is the United States has a concrete interest in Europe getting its act together and not engaging in such self-sabotage that we can have confidence in this alliance relationship.
Through this, are we breaking down their confidence in us? Do you think this is the best way to kind of get them back on the right track?
Well, that's an issue where I think reasonable people can disagree.
Yeah.
If you're too heavy-handed, that can have a counterproductive effect, certainly. On the other hand, I think the trends in Europe were such that they needed to have a little bit of shock therapy.
Okay.
And I think what the Trump administration is trying to do, at least as it thinks of this, is some tough love. We like Europe. We want this relationship. It's important to the United States. But you gotta stop doing some things that are really going to hurt you and have been hurting you over time. Now, how exactly you pull off that balance between shock and toughness and explanation and embracing, that's a balance that different people can come to different
It
conclusions.
sort of felt like the moment the U.S. started saying things differently, doing things differently, talking about things differently, a lot of our allies, I don't want to say ran into the arms of the CCP, but definitely, well, look at what Carney's doing right now. Like
Yeah.
it was almost like an immediate, hey, I'm going to start talking to this other girl. Like I used to talk to you, now I'm talking to this other girl. Is he trying to make us jealous? Is he sending his own shock from the north? What is
Well,
what is happening there? It's not just Canada too; it's other places.
no, that's right. Yeah. Well, to some degree, this is normal behavior from what you might call middle powers in the world. They want to maximize their own negotiating flexibility. They need geopolitical room for maneuver. So how do you do that? Well, you get too much pressure from one side, you cozy up to another power
Right.
and use that as leverage to try to carve out some more freedom of maneuver. So to some degree, that is classic behavior that the Canadians are engaging in. It's a dangerous move, though. When it comes right down to it, geography matters. Canada is where it is. The United States is where it is. China is an ocean away from Canada. If Canada overplays its hand with China, the United States is, got a lot of ways of expressing its displeasure with this. So I think the Canadians need to be careful. I understand why they would want to balance, but if they put all their cards in the Chinese basket, they could find themselves in a very, very uncomfortable position with the
Do
United
you see
States.
this with like NORAD sort of disintegrating and us removing like Canadian participation in NORAD and things like this? Could that be a next step? Or would that be real?
Well, I think that we're probably a long way from that kind of a move. But if things really get bad, could the United States take some very coercive steps against the Canadians? Yeah, I think that's.
We have a few Canadian portfolio companies, and I'm always shocked when I talk to people there and they're talking about bringing burner phones to the U.S. now, and I'm like, are you serious? You're actually serious about this? And I think some of them, sorry if I'm talking about you, actually were brainwashed enough to think that we're going to be collecting on Canadians when they come here, like they would be collected on when they go to China, which I think has kind of been a meme almost for the last week with this Canadian delegation in China. And brokering this deal, but also the memo that went out to the Canadian delegation saying like, you can't trust anything when you're in China. So you're signing up for this deal with somebody that you can't even trust.
I think it's fairly ironic for a country that took the actions that it took against the truckers that were protesting in Canada.
Debanking them.
I'd be a lot more worried about my own government in Canada tracking my phones. Thank you for saying that.
Yes. I bring that point up a lot. Although I was, we were the victim of debanking 4 years ago. My company, we had invested we banked with Bank of America. We typically invest in cybersecurity companies. We invested in a company that was building a censorship resistant privacy app on the layer 2 protocol of Bitcoin called the Lightning Network. So it was going to be like Signal built on Bitcoin. It is Signal built on Bitcoin. And there's pretty much, until quantum computing advances, there's pretty much no way for anybody to kind of invade this space or to stop one side or the other. And Bank of America shut down our bank account without telling us. This was during COVID. Mailed a check for several $1 million to an office that we weren't going to anymore. And one day I logged into my bank account and there was nothing there. Had to call the law firm we rented our office from. So it can happen here too. And people were joking about debanking, and Bank of America swore up and down for a while after that it was not because of the Bitcoin investment, but it literally happened right after we invested in a Bitcoin related company, and there was no other explanation for it. I had the only way I could get it back, and I didn't want to use a silver bullet that I had to get it back, was to talk about it in social media. And it went viral on social media to the point where somebody very senior at Bank of America reached out to me and said, could you please take that down? Like, we'll fix this for you. We didn't realize what we were doing. But I was like, no, what if I wasn't me? And I'm not taking it down. Eventually somebody convinced me to take it down, and I took it down. And now we're in the ultra VIP part of Bank of America, which still is kind of against I just didn't have time to change banks, and they treat me very well now, but ethically I'm not about it. That's a rant about Bank of America.
No, well, this is a real problem. This is a real problem, and that is indicative of the new world that we're living.
Right.
The technology has changed now to the point where governments can collect this information. They can act on it in ways that can be very punishing for people that don't toe the line that the government wants them to toe.
Absolutely, yeah, it's scary. A couple of other topics. We touched on Greenland. What about our ability to do what we did in Venezuela? Like, how does that play into our ability to kind of describe everything? I mean, it was such a flawless operation. My understanding is that there wasn't. We say that nobody was killed. Actually, nobody was killed, but I think somebody was injured in a helicopter, but it wasn't a serious enough injury that no one's talking about. So it was essentially a flawless operation.
No one killed on our side.
No one killed on our side. Yeah, who knows how many were killed on that side?
Yeah.
It's like 50, 100 plus.
Yeah.
But there's talk of a lot of new technology that was used to kind of like basically silence everything and allow our special operations forces to go in and like operate without really any retaliation at all. I'm imagining it's a combination of cyber, electronic warfare. These are not secrets. I'm assuming these are a combination of these things. If those things, what does this do for our ability to operate in a way we want the Trump administration wants to operate moving forward? Do you think this provides us a lot of leverage to do more things because people are like, holy cow, this was amazing? Sort of layering on top of the B-2 strike in Iran earlier this year.
What's interesting to me is that there are strategic aspects to the Venezuela operation. There are tactical aspects too. I think from a tactical point of view, this was a very impressive operation, no question about it. And the president himself alluded to these new capabilities without describing them specifically in his speech at Davos yesterday. Clearly, he wants the message out there to the world that we have some capabilities that are quite formidable that other countries need to take into account. And that is a form of leverage, I think, that can help with the United States in these bargaining sessions that are going to have to go on with other great powers. And I'm sure the Russians and the Chinese noticed all of this. And I'm sure that they are working very hard to figure out what exactly we did, what that
and they had some systems there that were the victims of these things, supposedly. I don't know if they were the most advanced systems, but
that's right. These weren't the Russians, for example, most advanced systems, but the Russians had sold a lot of equipment to Venezuela, not all of which, as I understand it, was fully operational and up and running, but at least some of it was. And it didn't appear to have a very impressive capability, given what we had done.
Like S-400s or something like that, or was
I'm not exactly sure what model air defense system they had sold to the Venezuelans. All that said, I think the strategic aspects of this are what interests me the most. And here, what the United States is essentially saying to Russia and China and others is this is a return to America's original approach to the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine. This is an approach to strategy that really flowed from our founding fathers, that first generation of post-independence American leaders, which said essentially that geography matters a lot to our ability to be sovereign, independent, free, and secure. And that starts with the Western Hemisphere, and it starts with the presence and activities of other great powers in our immediate neighborhood. We went through a period during the post-Cold War era where we basically neglected our neighborhood. We didn't think it mattered that much. Our ambitions went well beyond that. We took for granted that we weren't going to be threatened here. And we allowed some things to develop that I think in retrospect were not wise. The Chinese, for example, have, I think, in quite a deliberate way, targeted involvement in Latin America on mining and energy,
And also now,
yeah,
yeah,
port operations, strategic infrastructure that do have strategic implications for the United States. The Russians got involved in providing military capabilities to countries that were not friendly to the United States. These were things that Russia and China did for strategic reasons. And we essentially didn't think that this was all that threatening. And what we've said now is, no, these are things that we're not going to sit by and tolerate any longer. And we're not going to allow threats to the United States to originate in this part of the world. And I think Greenland is another example of that. That's a Western Hemisphere territory, control of which has real implications for American security in lots of different ways. So the Venezuela operation sent a very strong message to the region and to the rest of the world that this is a change for the United States that you need to reckon with.
yeah.
There are red lines for us here that we're going to enforce. And this is an approach that I think would have been very familiar to John Quincy Adams, for example, who was the father of the Monroe Doctrine, and I think felt quite concerned about the presence of extra hemispheric great powers here in this hemisphere.
Yeah.
It's not really something new. I think it's really a return to something that has long been fundamental to American strategy and American security.
That was back before foreign powers could reach into our society via cyberspace. So it's one thing to say, okay, China, you can't buy this island off of El Salvador and put a distribution center on it. That's really an intelligence base, but it's another thing to do all that, but still have the ability for foreign powers, China, Russia, to like live inside of our ecosystem that is cyberspace, and to, from an intelligence perspective, corrupt, any number of like politicians and stuff through internally to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I feel like the level of corruption inside the United States by the Chinese intelligence services is probably far greater than the average American understands. Mm-hmm. How do we, in a free society, so say we take care of that, outside of our borders, from a counterintelligence perspective, from a defensive perspective, how do we get back to trusting our own systems when we need them most? Because we might have this amazing, deterrence, and we might have this new trade deal set up with near peer adversaries, but if we can't trust our own systems when we need them most to deploy, assets because they're all linked, are we doing enough inside our own boundaries on our electronic systems to have that trust here as well?
Well, I would say no. I think the cyber domain is an interesting one because so many things intersect there. One, of course, is information. And the media environment that we live in is so different than the one I grew up in. Mm-hmm. When there were basically 4 national television networks,
right,
that all had this fairness doctrine that they had to abide by, meaning they had to show.
Yeah, that was nice.
Yeah, they had to show different points of view. They were mandated to do that, and they tried all to capture the bulk of the American viewership.
Mm-hmm.
So, you watch CBS News, you would not get a far left or a far right point of view.
Nobody hated Dan Rather for the most part.
Well, I mean, they were trying to capture a broad middle
Yeah.
to get as many millions of viewers as they could. So we were all watching essentially the same shows. We all had a common frame of reference, a common paradigm, more or less, for understanding and making sense of facts. We were also watching the same entertainment, reading more or less the same national newspapers, and they varied a little bit. Some were to left of center, some were right of center. Everybody knew that. But again, they were trying to capture a broad spectrum of the audience. That's not the case anymore. We now have a media spectrum that is very sharply broken up. And nobody's trying to capture a wide swath. They're trying to get engagement from a very narrow point of view and appeal to people that basically already think the same way.
Yeah.
And that is very divisive. It means national unity, feeling all a part of the same whole, is a lot more challenging. So that's one aspect of the new information space that cyber matters, because, intruders, hostile actors in this space can use this technology to try to activate, certain small segments on this and encourage points of view, reinforce perspective.
Also TikTok with the Palestinian movement.
Yeah, that's right. And these do have implications for, social stability and social cohesiveness. So that's one part of this. Another part of it is information gathering, because all, the cyberspace links all of these things. If you penetrate into these systems, you can gather information. It's espionage, essentially. That can compromise the security of the system. And then there's an offensive, a sabotage aspect to this too.
Yeah.
If I penetrate into somebody's cyber system, not only can I gather data, I can corrupt the system.
I can turn it off when we need it.
I can turn it off.
Yeah.
I can make it malfunction. I can make a missile that's supposed to hit there, hit somewhere over there instead,
Right.
or not fire at all. So the challenge in dealing with a domain like that, from our point of view, from a defensive point of view, is it's almost impossible to secure the system against penetration.
Yeah.
Because of the human factor.
Yeah.
Human beings are flawed. We make mistakes. Even if you use artificial intelligence to try to find O-Day vulnerabilities and correct them and all of that, you're inevitably going to deal with human beings that can make mistakes and provide avenues for entry into all of this that you're just not going to close down.
And so much of our critical infrastructure is run by the private sector. And this is debate, especially around like CISA and its involvement in the private sector. And like, obviously nobody wants too much government involvement in the private sector, but so much of it's riding on the private sector. So it's such a complex problem that we live in.
So you can't just be defensive. I mean, you want to be as prudent as you can in making penetrations of these systems as difficult as possible. It's never going to be perfect. So there has to be an offensive aspect to this.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, one of the best ways of understanding where the other side has penetrated you is to penetrate them.
Yeah.
Right? Find out what they know. And that means you're almost inevitably going to have to be constantly trying to find vulnerabilities in their systems.
Right.
And once you do, and once you penetrate them, you have no assurance that that vulnerability is going to be there over the long term.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't just say, oh, well, I penetrated the other side's system. I know what they know. You constantly got to be doing this again and again and again. Now, the other side doesn't know what your intentions are. Right? If I'm operating a system and I find somebody in it that shouldn't be there, I don't know whether his intention is simply to monitor and gather information or to sabotage. Right?
That's why you can't use the one-for-one comparison with offensive cyber with, say, like traditional infantry, because intelligence preparation of the battlefield or environment with an infantry unit is so different than cyber. It could take years to gain and maintain access in cyber to whatever your target is, whereas in infantry, equation. You might be like, let's go take that hill and look at it's okay, sir, this is where the bad guy is. But it's just so different. You're not taking 19-year-olds, seizing a hill. You're taking very sophisticated minds to break into something else.
That's right.
And then maintain that access for a long time until you need it most.
That's right.
For whatever it is.
Yeah. So what I think we're going to have to do is find a way of not allowing this to escalate, because I think in a system where the defense can never be fully secure, and you're incentivized to go on offense, and that offense is inherently threatening to the other side, you could wind up in a cycle here that can be difficult to control. So I think we're going to have redundancy. We're going to have to build resilience into the system. And we don't have near enough resilience, I think, as we need.
Yeah.
We can't allow ourselves to be dependent on single points of failure, that if we lose, we're in big trouble.
Right.
That goes for cyber, it goes with space. We have to have backup systems and backups to the backup.
Right. But if we're so reliant on these things, we can't just have like one version of it. There's got to be multiple versions of it. What about more traditional boots on the ground, counterintelligence domestically, spy hunting, not just this, obviously you're never going to take the cyber part of that now, but there are definitely, the ability for Chinese spies, let's just say, for example, to operate with impunity inside the United States is so much easier for them to do that than for us to do that inside China.
It's the nature of our system versus theirs.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. So how do we root that? How do we do that and maintain the same level of freedoms that we have in the United States that we have now? And it's
well, there's a trade-off here, right? If you look at security on a spectrum ranging from absolute security to absolute freedom,
right.
I can make our country a lot more secure by sacrificing freedoms that I think are central to the operation of our country.
Right.
That country looks a lot more like the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's right.
Than to the United States as we've conceived of it. So there has to be a balance, and there has to be a recognition that there's a trade-off.
Right.
At a certain point, you can take steps that do make you more secure, but you sacrifice things that I think are fundamental to the operation and the nature of it.
I thought universities would be like the first part of that front, like the first real step there, but it sounds like we're not really making an increased step to kind of curb the number of potential Chinese spies into our universities. But then again, what's a Chinese spy? Like it could be anybody from China that's asked to secure a piece of information because they're all kind of susceptible to the system. If they come here as an academic, anybody back in the motherland could be like, hey, we need you to do this one thing for God and country. And,
right.
So it's really, it's a spectrum. I get it.
It is.
Yeah.
But what you're really talking about is human enabled cyber.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a real problem.
It's a real problem.
Yeah. And inevitably there has to be government action to surveil, and that can be physical and it can be electronic. But clearly we have to be sensitive to this as a problem, and we have to deal with it in a way that does strike an appropriate balance between our freedoms and our security.
So, George, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about, we've sort of divided it up. There's other parts of the world we haven't talked about. Something that I think a lot of people think about, don't really know what the connective tissue looks like, but what is the relationship between Russia and China specifically in this new world order that we're in?
Well, taking a step back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the strategic triangle between the Soviet Union, China, and the United States was something that the United States used to deal with the Soviet threat. When Nixon came into office in 1969, the Soviet Union was on the ascent. It was engaged in a major strategic nuclear buildup. so that it looked like it was on a path to exceeding America's own capabilities and certainly quantitatively building a bigger arsenal. It looked like it was on the ascent in the third world, on the offensive there. The United States was overextended in the world. We had gotten ourselves entangled in the war in Vietnam in ways that were very detrimental, not just to our strategic position in the world, but inside the United States itself. It was a source of great internal division. And the United States needed a period of calm internationally so that it could, you know, basically recover, heal itself from a lot of the damage that had arisen.
And that was the 70s or
Yeah, because the 1960s and Nixon came in saying, okay, how do I retrench internationally, get myself out of this vulnerable position that we worked ourselves into in Vietnam,
right.
do so in a way that doesn't allow the Soviet Union to think that we're weak and vulnerable. And I think the solution that he came up with, in part, was to open relations with China, so that the Soviet Union had a lot more concern about dealing with not just the United States and the threats that we posed, but also those coming from China. And he also advanced détente with the Soviet Union. Now, what happened since the 1970s, and particularly during the post-Cold War period, was the United States decided that we didn't really have to worry about other threats. And we dealt with both Russia and China in ways that encouraged them to feel threatened by the United States, and in so doing, work together to counterbalance us, to contend with American power by bandwagoning with each other. I think that was a mistake strategically. It has compounded the problem the United States has in dealing with China itself. I talked earlier about what a challenge China poses. That challenge gets magnified quite significantly if you take the world's second largest population, largest economy measured by purchasing power parity, technological rivalry with the United States, increasing military rivalry, and let's couple that with the world's largest landmass, the world's largest nuclear arsenal, one of the world's richest supplies of energy and other raw materials.
Right.
That makes our geostrategic challenge that much greater. So I think one of the things that the United States needs to do, and one of the things that I think the Trump administration is trying to do in its national security strategy, is to encourage less cooperation, less partnership between Russia and China that's directed against us. We're not going to drive a wedge between these two countries.
Yeah.
That's not on the table. But we can do things that don't make Russia dependent on China, that give Russia a greater geopolitical room for maneuver.
What kind of things?
Well, improving the U.S.-Russian relationship, for example. If the United States and Russia have a more normal relationship, we have economic discourse. There are things that we can cooperate on. We find a way of accommodating each other's interests.
Like a peace board in Europe that's being
Like a peace board,
yeah.
sure. And making peace in Ukraine is a big part of this.
Yeah.
That gives Russia more leverage in its own relationship with China. Now, right now, Russia's dependence on China is such that China sets the terms of that relationship. It can tell Russia, here's how much we're willing to pay for natural gas and oil from you. And the Russians have no leverage in that because guess what? Are they going to sell it to Europe? Are they going to sell that to the United States?
Is Vladimir Putin aware enough, or is he surrounded by cronies where he knows that that's the case? Like he's basically, he knows.
He knows this. He knows that. I think there's a reason why he traveled to North Korea and established a renewed defense relationship with North Korea. We interpreted at the time as, oh, this shows how weak the Russians are and they need North Korean help in Ukraine. That's only a small part of it. A bigger part of this is Russia wants some leverage in dealing with China.
Yeah.
North Korea helps Russia and carve out some room for maneuver with the Chinese. The Russian-Indian relationship is another one. We look at,
I don't understand that one. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like,
if you look at the BRICS, the BRICS to some degree provide Russia with a forum in which it can maintain good relations with China, but also pursue good relations with India.
yeah,
And
Brazil.
minimizes the degree to which there's a trade-off there for Russia. Why is that good for Russia? It's good for Russia because it minimizes the degree of dependence they have on China itself. And I think one of the reasons why Putin wants to end the war in Ukraine is not because he doesn't think he can win it on the battlefield. I think it's because he needs a geopolitical relationship with the United States that minimizes the threats he faces from the West. That's part of this, but also gives him more room for maneuver vis-a-vis China. If you're going to be a great power, which Russia wants to be, it thinks of itself as, a great power can't be, a junior dependency of China.
Right.
You've got to have an ability to maneuver in the world in your own right. And that's an area where the United States and Russia have a common interest. We want Russia to have more independence from China. And the Russians, I think, want that too.
This is a bit of a diversion, but I'm curious your thoughts on this. Why is it that 4 years after the invasion of Ukraine, are there European countries still buying Russian gas?
Well, they need it.
Yeah, and we couldn't fill the void there with
No, that's right. The capacity of the United States to send liquefied natural gas, for example, to customers in Europe.
This is a pipeline issue. So this is just
It's a transportation and production issue. We simply don't have the capacity to meet the demands there.
and no Gulf state could do it as well. It's really only a physical pipeline from a place like Russia that has that much capacity that can.
Well, that's part of it.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes. So the states that are continuing to provide this or to purchase this from Russia are doing so because they need energy. Otherwise, they're in a big problem.
Yeah.
Energy, still is absolutely critical to the functioning of the world.
Right. Yeah. It's just always like, I think it's a great talking point when people are able to throw that out there. Just curious as to why, and there doesn't even really seem to be a plan to fix that in place. Like, cause I guess it's just too hard of a problem to solve. And everybody thought the war was going to be over with by now, or
it's not an insoluble problem, but it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes investment. It takes years to build this kind of infrastructure and capability. You can't do it on in a few days or weeks,
Yeah.
or months.
Do you think that a lot of this could be solved? A lot of the misconceptions about what the current administration is doing could be solved with better communications and sort of public relations and explaining
Oh yeah.
how this is all being done. So like, hey, we're talking to Russia this way because we want them to not be as aligned with China. Or maybe you don't say that out loud, but I don't think most people understand that that's part of a grander strategy. It's not just like leading up to Putin.
I think that's right. And here again, you've got a trade-off. There's a tension. President Trump is a deal maker. He thinks of himself as a deal maker. And when you're negotiating, when you're engaging in this sort of bargaining, leverage matters a lot. And he understands that. Nobody's going to tell Donald Trump how to make deals.
Right, yeah.
But inherently in that leverage, the more transparent you are about what you want and why you want it, the less leverage you have.
Yeah.
Right? Because you right off the bat, the other side knows, I know what he wants. I know, exactly where he's going to say yes and where he's going to say no and all of that. That gives the other side an advantage.
Yeah.
So I think the president wants to be somewhat opaque about what he wants and why he wants it, because that maximizes leverage. But what results from that is people that are trying to make sense of what it is he's trying to do and why are forced themselves to puzzle through what his motives are. What are we going after?
Yeah.
Why do we want Greenland?
Who does this? We thought we were going to have like a marine transport pulling up to the shores of Greenland and dropping off a bunch of Marines.
That's
and,
right.
Like walking through the
That's right.
streets like that. Nobody really thought that was going to happen. I don't think, but I guess maybe some European leaders did think that was actually
Oh,
possible.
sure.
Yeah.
And to some degree, he wants them to think that.
Yeah.
Right. You want to think, you want the other side to think, oh my gosh, he just might do this.
Yeah.
Right. That gives you leverage. And so I think the president has approached this by being rather opaque about what he's doing and why, and encouraging a belief on the other side that he's just crazy enough that he might do some things that people think are, absolutely out of the question.
It goes back to Marco Rubio's comments earlier. Like
That's right. Now, this has worked for him. It looks like it's working for him in Greenland, for example.
right.
But it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost in building the kind of base of popular support that you need in this country for these things to be successful and sustainable. And so again, this is an issue where a balance has to be struck. And if I were to criticize the Trump administration on its approach here, I think that they have sacrificed their explanatory power and the ability to build support, a coalition around this stuff in order to maximize their deal making and leverage in all of this. And when it comes to the Ukraine settlement, for example, they're going to have to make a pivot. Pretty soon, and I'm an optimist on this, I think we're going to get a deal where the Russians and the Ukrainians and we and the Europeans all say, okay, we've got a compromise that we all can live with here, that advances our interests, at least the things that are most critical to us. We don't like everything, we had to make some concessions, but this we think is good enough. Now you have to sell this.
Yeah.
You're going to have to come to the American people. You're going to have to come to Capitol Hill, talk to the Senate and say, here's why this is in our interest. And that's going to seem like an abrupt thing to a lot of people because they haven't been following a lot of this. There's been a media campaign in this country for years that have tried to frame this war as some sort of replay of World War II.
Yeah.
If you don't defeat that power, it's going to continue to expand and commit new acts of aggression. And as a result, they oppose a compromise settlement here. Now, the implications of that, of course, is that because they think this war began like World War II, that it has to end like World War II, which was unconditional surrender.
Right.
But you're not going to get an unconditional surrender here. We're not going to defeat the Russians on the battlefield. I think it's already clear the Ukrainians can't reclaim the territory that the Russians have conquered. That's not going to happen. They've tried to do that beyond their capability. And we're not going to defeat a nuclear power.
Right.
The Russians are not simply going to surrender and say, we're sorry, we shouldn't have invaded. What is it that you want us to do? There's going to have to be a compromise here. And that compromise has got to be one that protects Ukraine's vital interests and Russia's, and is also acceptable to the United States and Europe. That's where we're headed. I think that is a possible end here. But that there's the challenge of helping Americans understand why that's the way this thing has to end. And that's a communication challenge.
It's going to be a big PR challenge.
That's right.
Like,
That's right. And that's something that I think the Trump administration is going to have to tackle.
Yeah, especially for such a polarized country like we are right now.
That's right. That's right.
Well, George, thank you for joining us on the Coded for Chaos podcast today. I really appreciate it. This is one of the more interesting conversations we've had in a while. Last conversation was super, super technical and business focused. It's good to pivot back to international relations. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it.